share my screen. Hopefully you can all see these utterly adorable emperor penguin chicks. Now I'm going to take questions, but what I'm going to suggest is that since we're a little bit, it's quite going to be relatively short, is that if you could put your questions in the chat and then I'll answer them at the end. Now, who doesn't love penguins? I've loved penguins for at least 3 or 4 years now, and so far I've managed to see 8 different species of penguin, and were it not for COVID, I would be seeing 4 more in New Zealand this year, but sadly I've had to put my holiday off until next year. Now I'm going to talk to you about the peril that penguins are in, and a little bit more about the wider peril for not just penguins but certainly polar bears. And then I'm going to talk to you about why penguins matter. And I'm going to finish off by giving you some ideas for what you can do to help. That's great. For some reason, I'm not advancing my slides. Okay. Right, what I'd like to do is just to kind of warm people up a little bit about their feelings about penguins. It's just to run a quick poll, just to find out exactly what you already know about penguins, and then we can talk a little bit, and it's a good introduction to what's actually going on. So Jane, could I ask you to launch the poll, please? Poll number 1. Okay, what I'd like you to do is answer true or false to the questions. So, do penguins live at the North Pole?
There's one they live in and one they don't, isn't there?
Can everybody see those questions?
There are 8 altogether, so I'll have to wind down.
Okay. People should be able to individually scroll down.
Can people individually do that?
Yeah. So are you getting some results, Jane?
Yes.
Yes.
That's pescatarian though.
I should tell you that there is at least one trick question in this poll. So how are we doing for results, Jane?
I've got 4.
Would anyone else like to have a go?
5.
Should you give people another 30 seconds?
6. 8. 9. 10. Okay, shall I finish it? We've still got 9. No, 10.
Okay, can you show us the results, Jane?
I'm not sure.
If not, don't worry.
If I hit end polling.
Yes, you should be able to show the poll.
Share results.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Okay, let's go through those. Penguins live at the North Pole. No, they don't. There are no penguins in the Northern Hemisphere, apart from, that is, the occasional incursion from a Galapagos penguin, because Galapagos penguins live on the equator. Do penguins live at the South Pole? No, they don't. That was the trick question, because although they live in Antarctica, there are no penguins actually at the South Pole, because the South Pole is a long, long way from the coast. And penguins are seaside, they're ocean-going birds. The next question, do they live in South America? They do. They live on both coasts of South America. Do they live in Australia? They do live in Australia. They live in New Zealand as well. There are particularly a very small, in fact, the smallest penguin of all, which is the little blue penguin. Penguins are carnivores. Yep, they don't eat vegetation, they eat fish and similar things like that. No, penguins don't all look alike, although I guess I gave the game away by showing this particular slide, this particular picture. Penguins do spend 80% of their time at sea, which is, I always think, quite interesting because we tend to think of penguins as those little waddly guys on the shore. Penguins, they can't fly in the same way other birds can, but they can fly, because particularly gentoo penguins have this wonderful act to increase their speed in the water called porpoising. If you've ever seen a porpoise leap out of the water and then go back in, it's actually a more efficient use of energy, and it's something that a number of penguins do as well. So I guess you could say penguins do fly, but in a very uniquely penguin way. Okay. Right. Now, I mentioned that penguins don't live in the North Pole, but one of the things that penguins are in peril from is global warming. Now, I'm sure you're all aware that global warming is something that affects not just penguins, not just polar bears, but most species in one way or another. But one of the problems that animals or birds or bears or whatever they might be that live at either end of the world at the North and South Pole is that global warming is causing a lot of the ice shelves to melt. Now, this is actually more of a problem at the moment, right now, in the Arctic. And it's believed that within the next 30 years, there will be no summer ice in the Arctic. Now, that's a real problem because the Arctic is frozen sea. There is no land under the main North Pole. And for animals like polar bears, this is a real problem because polar bears live on the ice shelf. They eat, although they will eat anything, they primarily eat seals, which obviously if there's no ice there, won't be there. So there will become a problem. And the other problem is that there will be less food, and I'm going to talk about krill in particular a little bit later. But as the seas warm, the ocean currents change. And for an animal like the penguin that spends 80% of its time in the water, in the ocean, this is a real problem. And I'm going to talk about the specific problem that relates to with regard to penguins in a moment. But it also means that with global warming and with climate change, there are changes to the storm process as well, and some penguins are affected by that too. The other thing that perhaps a lot of people aren't aware of is that because of the increasing of carbon in the atmosphere, is that a lot of that carbon is now being dissolved in the ocean. And the real problem for polar animals is that cold water absorbs carbon faster than warm water does, so that the water around the poles is actually becoming more acidic. And that affects all of the animals in the water and obviously all of the animals that feed on those ocean-going animals. Now, I said I'd talk about polar bears because the threat to polar bears is even more extreme at the moment than penguins. But where polar bears go, penguins will follow in terms of potential for extinction. There are currently around about 26,000 polar bears. That's it. That's all there are. And polar bears, as I mentioned, rely on sea ice. Without sea ice, polar bears will start, and already are starting to go onto land that's inhabited by humans. And the problem with this is that although a polar bear at 600 pounds plus is a formidable apex predator, and they will hunt humans if they're on land. Well, certainly the males do. What happens is that polar bears, because they will eat anything, if they can't get seals, what they will do is go into human habitation and humans will kill them. Now that would be bad enough, except of course, if the polar bears aren't keeping the seal population down, there will be an excess of seals and the whole balance of nature will start to get out of sync. So polar bears, we think, will probably be around at most for another 15, 30 years if we don't do something now. Now, penguins, fortunately, live not just in Antarctica. In fact, only 2 species exclusively breed and live in Antarctica. The other 16 species of penguins live all over the southern hemisphere, and they range as far north as the Galapagos Islands. I mentioned that there is just one penguin that ventures into the northern hemisphere, and that is the Galapagos penguin, because astonishingly and unexpectedly, the Galapagos penguin actually lives on the equator. Now, one of the things that I think is so interesting about penguins is that they are quite unique. They are warm-blooded birds that have adapted to live in the cold streams of the oceans, on ice shelves, where you wouldn't really expect an animal to thrive, really. And what's even more extraordinary is that they are a bird that has adapted to swim underwater and not fly. I mentioned that penguins, they don't have wings. What they have is flippers. And this makes them extraordinarily well adapted to swim underwater. And they are masters of swimming underwater. They, interestingly, because we mostly think of penguins as waddling along on the ice, is that they're pretty well adapted to walking long distances as well. And certainly emperor penguins can walk as far as 50 or 100 miles. That's amazing. They're not fast and they look awkward while they're doing it. But because they're designed, or they've evolved to have their feet positioned at the back of their bodies, waddling is actually the most efficient way to walk on land and ice for a penguin. But as an animal, or a bird specifically, that spends 80% of its time in the ocean, it is impacted by any change that happens in the ocean. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that's beneficial to us a little later. But penguins live in Antarctica. They live on all of the southern islands in the southern hemisphere. They live in the Galapagos Islands. They live on both coasts of America. They live in Australia. They live in New Zealand and even South Africa. So there are a lot of penguins around, but their numbers are dwindling. Now, the second peril after climate change is plastic from household waste. And if you've read anything about the problems of plastic in the oceans in particularly, but on beaches as well, you won't be surprised to know that 8 million tons of plastic waste is chucked into the ocean every single year. They reckon that by 2050, there will be more plastic than fish. That is just awful when you think that the majority of our planet is ocean. And they reckon also by 2050 that every single penguin will be eating plastic within its diet, either from krill or from fish or other things that penguins eat. And the problem with plastic and consuming plastic is that it reduces, because it settles into the stomach, it reduces nutrition, which means there's less space for proper nutritious food to be absorbed and used. The other problem with plastic is that it is very good at absorbing industrial toxins. So penguins and other animals, fish and all the rest of them that eat plastic unwittingly will actually start to die. Their opportunity for staying alive and fighting off predators is significantly reduced. Now, I said I'd mention krill. Krill are lovely. They are a particular kind of crustacean. They look very much like shrimp. When consumed and excreted by penguins, they smell like shrimp. And they are the core thing that penguins eat. Now, many penguins eat fish and they eat squid. And you're not going to believe this, but they also eat the gonads of jellyfish. I can't remember where I read that, but I'm sure it was on a World Wildlife Google page. And the thing with krill is that it is extremely nutritious. Krill are full of omega-3, and this is something that fishing and humans have discovered is a very good source of those particular nutritional benefits. Now, they're not generally used when they're fished, when the krill is fished. It's not generally used in things like omega-3 oil, but it is very widely used for animal feed. And one of the big problems is that krill only live under ice sheets. They feed on algae that attach themselves to the underside of ice sheets, and therefore without ice sheets there's less krill. Unfortunately, as long as humans fish for krill, there will also be less krill. And krill doesn't just feed penguins, it feeds whales, it feeds seals, and a whole variety of other animals. But without krill, penguins will find it much more difficult to continue. Now, the fourth peril that penguins are facing at the moment is habitat erosion. Quite frankly, there are just too many humans on the planet at the moment. And for example, if you look in Australia and New Zealand and the Galapagos Islands, this is actually a real problem. Not only are the penguins there suffering from bad weather, which is stirring up things, it's changing ocean currents. Humans are removing grass. They've introduced animals like rabbits and cats, and particularly red foxes, which eat penguins. Now, penguins are interesting, is that because although they have a number of predators in the ocean, until recently, until humans came along, they had no enemies and no predators on land. So they're not really that clever at staying away from these sorts of animals that we've introduced. In South Africa, they suffer from dogs in particular because the human habitation is almost at the beaches, which is where the penguins are actually trying to breed. And there's a real problem with penguins being run over in South Africa. In South America, again, it's more human settlements because the guano that penguins produce is so full of things like nitrogen and stuff like that, is that the guano is a phenomenal fertilizer. And until quite recently in South America in particular, and Chile in particular, is that their guano was collected for use as farming products. Now, many penguins actually make their nests in their guano, so obviously that's a major problem. There's things like open pit mining, which is again eroding the habitats that penguins have. In the Falklands, interestingly, one of the big problems they have there, and they have about 4 or 5 different species of penguin in the Falkland Islands, is that there's a problem with mines, and that penguins, if they step on a mine, obviously immediately disappear. In Antarctica, there's fishing, as we talked about, and now there's a bigger problem because so many people now want to go and see penguins in Antarctica, is that there is a problem and they're having to limit tourism. But everywhere there are oil slicks. And there was a wonderful example, and there's a great TED talk about it, about how 20,000 penguins were rescued in South Africa from the oil spills. Big problem with penguins is they're ocean-going birds. If they get oil on their feathers, is that they lose their waterproofing and drown. Okay, I thought we'd have another quick poll because you've been listening to me for a little bit. Jane, can I get you to launch the second poll, please?
I love that little guy.
He's lovely. This is actually a royal penguin and he lives in New Zealand.
Holes.
He's one of
Right.
only two white-faced penguins. All other penguins have black faces.
Okay, can you see that?
Hold their breath for 20 minutes.
Fabulous.
Emperor penguins, rarest, don't think so. Commonest
Fun fact about penguins.
crow, solid bones, no, I don't think they do. Penguins can drink salt water.
How are we doing, Jane?
Not very well yet. Yeah, they're beginning to mount now. Can you hear a sound like an aircraft?
In the background, yes.
Yeah. Somebody's hoovering.
It's a good idea for people, if you're not speaking, can you mute yourselves? Because otherwise some of the other people on the call will be able to hear your background noise.
Not to mention your answers to the quiz.
Yes. I can't actually see everybody, so I don't know who it might be.
And by Toastmasters.
I've got 7, 8.
Public speaking and stuff. I was recommended to join, but I never had the nerve. I don't like public speaking.
Could be worse, Jane. I was in a Zoom session a couple of weeks ago and someone took an overseas telephone call.
Oh, great.
I'm not sure what the language was, but we were all mesmerised. Okay,
I'm up to 13, so that may well be.
Let's go with that.
As many people as want to take part in that. End polling, share results.
Okay. You all know penguins can hold their breath for 20 minutes. I was absolutely gobsmacked when I learned that. But penguins go deeper than certainly any other seabird and quite a lot of animals and probably most sea mammals. The rarest penguin is not the emperor penguin. The rarest penguins are actually the Galapagos penguin and the yellow-eyed penguin, and I'll say a little bit more about those in a moment. The commonest penguin in zoos is the Humboldt penguin. If you've ever been to a zoo, a bird world or an aquarium and seen penguins, there's probably a very good chance you've seen Humboldt penguins. And one of the reasons is that they're one of the warmer weather or warmer terrain or warmer ocean penguins, and therefore they're the ones that are easiest to keep in zoos without having considerable refrigeration. Penguins have solid bones. They are one of the very few bird species that do, and the reason is because when they lost their ability to fly, is that they've evolved to be able to sink in the water. And in order to do that, their bones have become solid. So penguins are probably heavier than you might think. But the reason is so that they can go down to the lower levels of the ocean quickly. They can drink salt water. If you've ever seen penguins sneeze, one of the reasons is that they have a little organ under their eyes that's I guess connected to their nose and mouth. And when they eat, they don't tend to drink a lot of water, don't penguins? They get, rather like cats, they get their water from their food. But obviously if they're eating a lot of seafood, well, mostly seafood as they do, they're going to collect a lot of salt. And they have a little gland that extracts the salt. And when a penguin sneezes, it's sneezing its salt out. Okay, they are designed to swim, but as I mentioned, they're pretty good at walking as well. Although a penguin can swim at up to about 22 miles an hour, it can walk probably faster than you and I can, or run faster than you and I can walk. They don't have waterproof fur, they have waterproof feathers. Hopefully you were listening that penguins are actually birds, but you'd be surprised how many people think that. And the last and kind of a bit of a trick question was, penguins don't mate for life. This is, I don't know where this idea has come from. There are 2 or 3 species that do, the Galapagos penguin being one of them, but most penguins are serially monogamous. What they will do is mate for 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 or 4 seasons with the same bird. But they're not especially, unless they've actually got a chick or an egg, they don't mind switching partners. Because if you think about it, penguins collect together in very large numbers, and therefore finding your mate from the last season can often be quite difficult. Some penguins are more promiscuous than others, shall we say, and the Adelie penguin in particular is especially promiscuous, shall we say. Okay, so why do penguins matter? We might love them, we might like them, but you might say, well, so they disappear, what's the problem? Well, let me tell you a little bit more about why they're so important. You may be surprised to know that penguins are one of the few surviving early bird species. Dinosaurs disappeared about 65 billion years ago. Sorry, that should be million. Yeah, million, not billion. And when birds evolved from dinosaurs, penguins were one of the first bird species to shoot off from birds. So contrary to what certainly I thought when I started investigating penguins, is that penguins have been around for a very, very long time. Now, the original penguins, certainly from the bones that the fossils that have been found, is that they used to be a lot bigger. They have only really ever been in the southern hemisphere. Although there have been similar birds like the great auk, which was in the northern hemisphere in Canada, is that the biggest penguin that we know about was about 1.65 meters tall. In other words, the height of a person, because that's about how tall I am. And this compares to the emperor penguin, which is 1.1 meters tall at the moment. But what I think is important about this is that penguins have been around for so long. I think it would be an enormous tragedy to lose an animal that has been part of our world for as long as it has. The other thing about penguins is they're what's called a sentinel species. Now, what this means is that penguins are rather like canaries. They offer us an advance warning of environmental danger. Because they're all over the place, because they occupy and they swim around most of the oceans, amazingly, penguins can swim as far as several thousand miles a year. They really do cover a lot of ground. And one of the interesting things is that they will crop up in places that you don't expect them to see. So you'll get, for example, macaroni penguins turning up in South Africa, even though their normal mating ground is about 2.5, 3 or 4,000 miles away. But they are big travelers. And from that point of view is that when a sentinel species starts to suffer, then you know that the environmental problem is very widespread. So the fact that we've lost so many penguins since the 1980s, when they started recording numbers, is a clear indication that we have a serious problem with our oceans at the moment. You may be aware that there are now dead zones in the oceans. Obviously, that's somewhere that penguins don't go. But the dead zone is an area in the ocean that is devoid of all life. Think about that for a minute. That is truly scary. The other thing about penguins is that they're mesopredators. What that means is that unlike an apex predator, which like humans or like polar bears, that are at the top of the food chain, is that penguins are in the middle of the food chain. And what that means is that if you lose something in the middle, it affects both the upper end of the food chain and the lower food chain as well. In the case of penguins, they eat krill and fish, and leopard seals eat penguins. Leopard seals are probably the main predator that penguins have in the oceans, and they've become very good at avoiding them. But without penguins, leopard seals would probably also die out as well, because they would lose their prey. So that's something to think about. Now, for those of you who've seen some of my other penguin talks, you know I have a thing about penguin poo. And one of the things I'd like to say is that penguins have an ornithogenic impact. What that means is that their poo, because I think they eat such nutritious food, fertilizes both the landscape and it fertilizes and enriches the ocean as well. Without that, there would be one less source of this fertilizing of the ocean, and the ocean would suffer as a result. And probably the most important reason is humans love penguins. Now, I love penguins, as you can tell from my t-shirt, but the truth is that most people love penguins. Not only have we had a number of films about penguins, you're probably familiar with Happy Feet, one of my favourites, Mr. Popper's Penguins, which is, if you haven't seen it, I do recommend it. It's totally crazy, especially if you like Jim Carrey, but it does actually have live penguins in it. And of course, the Penguins of Madagascar. Because the original film was so popular, someone decided that the penguins who had a bit role in the original film needed their own film. And there have in fact been 2 films of the Penguins of Madagascar. Totally nuts. Now, penguins are all protected. All species of penguins around the world are under protection, worldwide protection. And humans love penguins, I think, because they're one of the very few animals that walks upright, looks slightly awkward, and somehow, well, because we anthropomorphize animals that walk and act like us, is that we just love them. And what's interesting is that almost every zoo, every bird world and aquarium in the world has penguins. You'd be interested to know there are 30 to 35 zoos and bird worlds in the UK alone that have penguins. And remember, it'll mostly be Humboldt penguins. I fear that Humboldt penguins are endangered, and it may well be that within the next 10 years there will be more Humboldt penguins in zoos than there are in the wild. That's truly sad, I think. Now, the penguins that are in most imminent danger, I mentioned the yellow-eyed penguins, the hoi-ho in New Zealand. Now, please take these figures with a pinch of salt, because the problem with penguins is that they're quite hard to count. But they reckon that there are certainly less than 300 breeding pairs of yellow-eyed penguins left, and they reckon they've got less than 20 years before they become completely extinct. They're quite shy. As I said, they live in New Zealand. They actually make their nests in the tropical jungle, not on the beach like most penguins do. And they are probably one of the oldest species of penguin that we have left. The Galapagos penguin, as I mentioned, there's less than 1,000 breeding pairs left in the Galapagos Islands, and they are particularly impacted by climate change. Being so far north is that they rely on cold water currents coming up from Antarctica in order to be able to survive. Without those currents, the Galapagos penguins will almost certainly die out, and probably quite quickly. The Fiordland penguin, also in New Zealand, there are less than 10,000. We're not quite sure exactly how many, because they are very shy. And unlike most other penguins, they don't form large colonies. So they tend to have small colonies of, say, 10 or 15 penguins. And as I say, they are quite shy. The Humboldt penguin I mentioned, at 32,000, it's not going to be long before there are many in zoos. I mean, fortunately, a lot of penguins do actually breed quite well in zoos, but it's a very far cry from having them in the wild. The African penguin, as I mentioned, there are less than 40,000. And just to put this into context, the most numerous penguin is the macaroni penguin, and there are just 6.3 million breeding pairs left. And those numbers are declining, and that is the most numerous penguin. Now I'm going to tell you about some specific penguins now, because I sponsor penguins, and I sponsor penguins with the World Wildlife Fund, and I'd like to tell you about Snowdrop, Flappy and Polo, because they are Adelie penguins. Those are the ones with the white eyes that they always look rather surprised. And what the World Wildlife Fund has been doing is that they've been monitoring breeding patterns, and these 3 penguins have all had chicks this year. In fact, Polo has done really well. She's managed to bring 2 eggs to become 2 chicks, which is fairly uncommon amongst penguins. They only lay 1 egg or 2 eggs at most at a time, and normally only 1 survives. But the World Wildlife Fund has tagged these penguins, and they are monitoring the whole colony, but specifically these, and I think another 3 or 4 penguins, to find out what their breeding patterns are like and how they're being impacted by the various impacts or perils that we've talked about. Adelie penguin populations have fallen by more than 65% in the last 25 years, and their biggest threat now is global warming and krill fishing. Adelie penguins are one of the 2 species of penguin that live permanently in Antarctica. The Adelie lives on or close to sea ice all its life, but it breeds on ice-free land, which in Antarctica is something of in shortage. So it's not so easy. So they are doing less well than a lot of penguins, even though there are quite a lot of them still around. The second penguin I wanted to tell you about is Skipper. Skipper is a South African penguin. She was picked up by the guys at SANCOB, and SANCOB, by the way, is the South African Foundation for the Conservation of Coastal Birds. I think the initials are related to probably the Afrikaans expression for this. Her biggest threat, or the biggest threat to African penguins, is habitat erosion and plastic pollution. Being in South Africa is that they're more in the thick of things, and they are very impacted, particularly, as I say, by habitat erosion. She was picked up by 4 kayakers when she was a young bird, and she likes humans so much that when they picked her up at the foundation, is that they decided that she was too imprinted on people to be able to be re-released out into the wild. So she lives out her life in a sort of luxury, unlike most African penguins. And in order to help pay for that, I sponsor her with a sum of money every year so that she's got proper food and there's someone paying for her care, etc. As I say, she loves humans. Were it not for COVID, I would love the opportunity to go there to South Africa and meet Skipper in person. But I have a number of videos of her, which is not really much consolation. Okay. Now, you're probably thinking, I've got to do something. Certainly I did when I learned all this. And there are some things that you can do now. Now, I could tell you that you need to support conservation efforts generally. But let me tell you, is that if everybody did these things, it would make a significant difference. Because of COVID at the moment, is there are a lot of people using disposable face masks. If you do nothing else, apart from the second one on this list, if you're wearing a face mask, and I hope you are, is that use a reusable one. Use a cotton one that you can wash so that you're not building up on the amount of waste that's being generated by these things. There's a lot of PPE stuff going into waste at the moment. You can make a difference by just making that small change. The other thing is buying bottled water. It's unnecessary. We stopped using bottled water about 5 years ago, and we use filtered water. The problem is that people buy bottled water, they take the plastic bottle and they throw it away. One of the biggest problems with plastic pollution isn't just carrier bags, it's bottled water bottles. The other thing is repair and reuse. There's a big movement at the moment to encourage people not to throw their clothes away, but to say goodbye to high fashion and repair the clothes they have and reuse them. So you can use things like swap shops and so on. But that means there's less clothes going into waste. The other thing is to reduce your food waste as well. If you haven't got a waste disposal system, and I think a council-wide food waste disposal, then make some moves to try and make that happen. Eat local and in season. The reason this is important is that it lowers your carbon footprint, because if you're eating local and in season, there's less food having to be transported to you. So go to your farm shops, check what food is in season, or even grow your own. And these are little things that will make a difference. Switch off electrical goods. This is called zombie use of electricity, is that we keep a lot of devices on overnight. If you're not using them, turn them off. And finally, switch to renewable energy. I think we all know how important that can be. Is that number of the energy companies, I use OVO, and they have a completely renewable energy subscription that you can sign up for. It doesn't use non-renewable energy. And finally, if you care about penguins, and there are lots of opportunities for this, adopt one. Everybody who adopts a penguin is showing they care. Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Thank you very much indeed, Jackie. I didn't realise that even you knew quite so much about penguins.
I didn't before 2 weeks ago. I've done a lot. I have to say it was a labour of love.
You really have given us a huge amount of information about penguins, and lots of lovely pictures as well. I agree with you. They are adorable creatures, but we must make sure we don't lose them. That's absolutely terrible idea.
I think if we lose penguins, we will have lost a lot of other things as well,
because
they don't go by themselves.
The very idea that they're in the middle of the food chain, I think that's really meant a lot to me. It shows that just how many different creatures would be affected if we lost them. So does anybody have a question? You need to unmute yourself, and then you're very welcome to speak, or you might write it in the chat if you prefer. The chat is there for everyone. So Leslie says, are there any specific charities that support penguins?
Oh goodness, where to start? A lot of the local, you'll probably find your zoos, and certainly I visited Birdworld a couple of weeks ago. They both allow you to support various animals by making a contribution. One of the best ones to start with is probably the World Wildlife Fund. They support a number of different animals, but they have a specific adoption process for supporting penguins. I support, as I say, the South African conservation place, and the reason I do that is because I watched a whole series of videos on TV last year, and I thought, it was so specific. You got to know the individual penguins, and I thought, no, I've got to support this. There's a whole range. If you Google penguin support or penguin adoption, you'll find there's a whole range of places out there. There's a website, I think it's called Penguin World, which gives you names of different places that you can support them. But there's a lot of places out there.
Okay, Jackie, there's another question here. Some endangered species are helped by tourism, such as the mountain gorilla. The fact that tourists come encourages local people to protect them. Are there any specific penguin species helped by tourism in this way?
Yes, no. Generally speaking, penguins tend to live in relatively non-tourist places. I mean, the places that you can see penguins. I mean, I mentioned that I'm hopefully going to go to New Zealand next year. And what they've done locally is that they've put together some penguin-friendly tourist trails that manage the tourists in such a way that they help to protect the penguins. And the money you pay to attend those actually goes towards the people who are supporting the penguins. So there are those in New Zealand. To be honest, is that I think going to the zoo and seeing penguins is quite a good way to support them. I think particularly at the moment, because zoos are struggling to have people attend. So that's one way of supporting them. Generally speaking, I mean, there's not really a problem. Well, there is at the moment. There's a problem with people going to Antarctica, but there's quite a lot of places. Most countries tend to leave penguins pretty much alone these days because they are protected. But if you want to see Galapagos Island penguins, go in the next 10 years, or you won't see them because they won't be there. But most people go to the Galapagos Islands not to see penguins. They go there to see the blue-footed boobies or the big turtles. So yeah, I think at the moment, particularly at the moment, go to your local bird sanctuary or zoo that has penguins and support the zoo, because zoos do an awful lot to support the conservation effort for penguins.
Okay, we've got a comment from Judy Goldie. How do we make people aware of the fact that you must use that you mustn't throw away masks in the street? And I know why she's saying that, because she and I have been litter picking together, and it's amazing how many of these reusable masks you find just chucked on the street. It's horrific.
You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things I do, because I'm sort of shielding, is that my husband and I walk around our road, which is quite nice and open, and I'm astonished by the number of masks, disposable masks, we've seen just chucked on the side. I wish I knew the answer to that question. I think it's a matter of informing people, showing people by example.
Perhaps we need to have
a mask, give it back to them.
Perhaps we need to have special mask collection points like the dog poo ones.
No, we need to discourage people from using disposable masks. I mean, it's not necessary for the man in the street. It is necessary in hospitals. We can use cotton masks. They're just as good for what we need them for.
Anybody else? I have a comment for everyone, which is, do come to the talk on plastic pollution, which is, I think it's the next one, but obviously I'll email everybody to tell you exactly when it is, because that will carry on with some of the points that Jackie's been making about not using plastic and at least disposing of it responsibly.
It's one of those things, is that the majority of plastic waste in the ocean is from household waste. So we can't use the excuse that we're not a corporate and therefore it's not our responsibility. It's up to us to do something.
So there are two things on the Speak Up for Our Planet website which you could look at. One is about reusable things, and even earbuds can be reusable. So I'm very interested for people to contribute ideas, information they have about reusable things that you've discovered. Share the information with me and I'll put it on the website. And the other thing I was going to say about the website is I'm very interested to have more speakers. And it occurred to me while Jackie was speaking that it would be great if we could get a speaker on the subject of renewable energy. Somebody who could talk to us about how to choose a supplier, you know, what to look for, because there are some good suppliers, but I think probably like me, a lot of people are thinking, well, how do I know whether they're actually doing what they say they do?
Very good point, Jane.
Helen Phillips says, should we reintroduce the Keep Britain Tidy of years ago and put out litter bins again?
I think we should adopt an approach that they have in Japan. I visited Japan a couple of years ago, and one of the interesting things there is they don't have litter bins. And the reason they don't is because their culture is to take their litter home or to not produce it in the first place. The problem with litter bins is that although it's a good way to collect the litter in a way that you can manage it, is that it still encourages people to throw things away. We actually want to move to where people don't throw things away.
Yeah. Eileen says, in terms of climate change, should we continue to discourage people from flying?
Yes.
Yes.
One of the interesting things about COVID is that because people are doing a lot less flights, is that actual pollution has gone down.
Yeah.
And I think the carbon footprint has reduced as well. I wouldn't advocate doing away with flights altogether because we don't really have a good alternative. And I think the tourism industry would fall apart if we encourage that. But I think you need to think, do I need to fly? And I think this is probably particularly true of businesses. Do you really need to fly?
Living where I do, it's been lovely recently. There've been so many fewer flights. I hope that some of the businesses that used to send their staff all over the world to meetings will have learnt that they don't need to send quite so many people around the world quite so often.
Yes.
That Zoom calls, you know, they'll do for some of the time. I agree that sometimes people need to meet, but yeah. Anyway, any more questions? Sorry, go on, Jackie.
I was going to say I've been doing international mentoring for about 7 or 8 years now, and I've never flown and seen any of my mentoring clients if they're not in the UK. It works fine.
No, exactly. So I would like to suggest that everybody gives Jackie a big round of applause. You can unmute yourself if you like in order to be able to make a noise, or just clap like this. Thank you very much indeed, Jackie. It's absolutely terrific.
Oh,
And
Jackie.
go on, Brian.
I was just saying thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank
If
you very
anyone
much
has a
indeed.
penguin question, is that I am, if not a fountain of knowledge, I know where to find it out.
Yeah, so if anybody thinks of questions that they wish they'd asked, just drop me a line on the email and I'll pass them on to Jackie. Thank you very much indeed. It's great.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
I've just realised, Jane, I think I vastly overran on time.
No, it's fine. It's fine. You're perfect. It's 8:30 now, so that's great.
But there's just so much to share, and you didn't know how much I cut out.